Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Come and See. Today we're going to talk about violence at home. So we have three different perspectives with us here. We have the perspective of a therapist, a law enforcement, as well as a teenager who has seen this happen to her friends and has gone through some of their experiences with them. Can you introduce yourselves, please?
My name is Nancy Shockey. I'm a therapist and owner of Vanguard Therapy.
I'm Mayor Krishnuda, and I'm a teenager in high school.
And I am John Shockey, and I was prior law enforcement for 7 years.
Okay. So my first question, how does violence at home affect the person going through it? I feel like that can be a question for Nancy.
How does it affect the person going through it? In terms of the person that's being abused, it causes a lot of physiological symptoms. They can't sleep, maybe they're always nervous, they're anxious, they probably, some people can't eat, some people overeat, so it impacts people differently. So it also impacts people's functioning. If I'm being abused at home, I may be less likely to be as productive at work, or I may be, not parenting as effectively because you're walking on eggshells in the household. There's no peace.
John, can you tell us how you feel like it has affected families that maybe you've gone to see and so on? I don't really know a lot about violence at home, so I would like to know a little bit more from those who have experienced it even through others.
So I've had a chance to kind of look at it from two different lenses. One lens is working in law enforcement. I spent a lot of times in the domestic violence unit. So violence at home is literally what I dealt with every day, responding to calls for violence at homes. And then I also saw it from the servant's perspective at church, where I saw more of the effects on the children and what's happening there. So from the law enforcement perspective, you're breaking a home apart, because once the law gets involved, and we will get involved eventually, violence can't continue in countries like the US or somewhere in Europe or things like that without the law eventually being involved. And once you do, there is no way out. So you kind of, and I don't say that to scare people from getting the law involved, but the person who's committing the violence needs to understand that there's a price for what they're doing, whether he or she are the ones that are committing the violence. And from the servant's perspective, that price, a lot of the times, is seen in the children. Children that come from a home that has a lot of violence, they manifest in many different ways. Either they're skittish, they're fearful, they're angry, and it makes it harder for them to have trust in anybody, in a servant, in abuna, in anybody at church, or just in generally in their life. So as a parent, when you are being violent in your household, you're not just affecting your spouse, you're affecting, the entire dynamic.
Who can be a victim of this type of violence? Is it just women, men, children, all? From your experiences, what have you seen?
There is no particular image of what a victim of domestic violence looks like. It could be children, it could be women, it could be men, and violence can happen in various ways. You have verbal abuse, where like somebody's being emotionally abused and called names or threatened. You also have other forms of violence, like financial abuse. So I keep my partner in this marriage by dominating the finances, by taking control of all the money. They don't know anything about what's coming in, what's going out. I handle all that to control my partner. So you also have, physical abuse, if somebody's being hurt or harmed physically. The other one is, child abuse. Children are being neglected. They're not being fed. They're not being nurtured emotionally. They're not being taken care of, with their academics. There's neglect and abuse there. So there is no particular individual of what you know, family violence looks like, people always assume that it's just a female that is the victim of domestic violence or family violence. It affects anybody and everybody, and it can impact men. It's just with our society and the messages we give, men are very silent of how it impacts. You know, like there's men that are in abusive marriages where the wife gets physical, but they don't talk about it out of shame, out of guilt, out of embarrassment.
I want to concentrate a little bit on our youth. Majorca, tell me one of the examples that you've seen before.
In high school, there's a lot, but most kids decide to hide it because they think if they talk about it, people might think they want attention. And even if they talk about it to a kid, they might think, oh, what can a kid do? So, for example, one of my friends, she's always scared to go home due to her getting hurt by her parents, and her parents are divorced. So her mom does alcohol usage, and she uses alcohol a lot. So it's mainly because of that, and since her mom's going through a difficult time, she uses alcohol to get through it. But during the alcohol usage, she goes and takes out her anger on her daughter. So her daughter's scared to go home, so she tries to spend more time outside of the house and makes excuses like she's staying after to stay for a project, or she's going to go over to a friend's house and stay there for a little while. So she's terrified to go home, and she's talked to us about it. And when we get a friend to come to us like that, we're afraid. We don't know what to do. And the kids just don't take it seriously. Some kids might just blow it off, be like, oh, you'll be fine. And they won't take it seriously. They don't think it's that dangerous. But some friends might go and tell them to tell another adult that can do something, like a counselor or something. Mm-hmm. But they'll be terrified to do that because they don't want their parents to get in trouble. So I think the main reason people don't get help, and this keeps going on, is because they're afraid to, and they don't want to be the reason that their parents are in trouble.
Okay, so
can I jump in?
Sure. I was going to actually ask you for your opinion, but I'm sorry, before I ask you about that, I just wanted to mention that we're talking about the subject today not because it happens outside. This happens inside our society as well. And let's talk about it within our church as well. There are a lot of these cases. Again, we don't know about them because people hide them, but we want to put it out there. There is domestic violence within our community, within the Egyptian community, within the Orthodox community. So whatever we're saying right now relates to everything else that's happening. But John, I wanted to ask you, what could kids her age do?
And that's exactly, yeah, no, it's a good question, because a lot of people approach this subject with a lot of misconceptions, right? So a lot of people, when they hear that a friend is having a problem like this, they don't believe they have any power to stop it. They believe it's beyond them. And that's not true. It's not beyond you to help. And like Majorca said, some people are scared that if they help, their parents are going to get in trouble because of them helping. At the end of the day, you're in a Christian household, right? You're called to help. You're called to show love. So, even from a law enforcement perspective, nothing would happen to you or your parents if you go to somebody about somebody else's abuse, right? I personally don't believe in coincidences, right? So when you find out something, when you hear something, God is allowing you to hear and find out about this so you can act. The important thing is to act with wisdom. And what that involves is going to somebody that you trust that can guide you through what you need to do. In situations like this, it's simple. Go to your parents, go to an older person that you trust, explain to them the situation, and they're going to know what to do. And if they don't, go to somebody else, because sometimes even the adults are too scared to act. Okay?
What happens to the abuser? So there will be consequences to what they're doing, obviously. What happens when law enforcement steps in? Are the children taken away? I mean, is there...
There's a lot of steps to it. So
okay.
I can tell you here in the U.S. what the law is in the majority of the states.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I feel like that's one of the major points that people are scared of. If they do say it, then they are breaking up their family.
So I want to interrupt for 1 second. I want to clarify a myth that we have in our society about reporting violence in the home. So I have worked in child protective services, so I do have experience. A lot of people have a fear that if they go to a school counselor or teacher or report it to child protective services, that the family's automatically torn apart and the kids are going to end up in foster care, and you know, it's all that child's fault for talking about the violence that's going on. And this is a huge myth that prevents these children from being protected. And the reality is, child protective services is flooded with a lot of children. So the last thing that they want to do is break apart any family. The goal of child protective services is to keep the family unit strong. So what will happen if, let's say, you call child protective services and say, so-and-so is being abused or they're being hit at home. What will happen is somebody will go to the house, investigate. If they see bruises, if they see cuts, if they see consistent wounds on this child, then there is some sort of abuse going on. And what will happen is they'll keep the case open for 6 months to a year, depending on the family situation, and a social worker will follow up the status of the home to see how things are going. And what will happen in that period is they'll probably offer parenting classes. The perpetrator who's abusing the child or, you know, the mother will be court mandated to end up on my couch. And that's where anger management comes in, is I will have a client who now has to accrue anger management hours to give it back to the judge and say, you know, this is what I'm doing to unify my family and work on myself. So the automatic thing is the family will not be broken apart. That is a myth. I just want to clarify. So if you know somebody who is struggling with abuse at home or a child that's being hurt, please speak up. Talk to an adult, talk to somebody, because everybody deserves to be safe and protected.
So there is an investigation that goes on, because again, like all of my knowledge about the subject comes from the movies that I see on TV. And in the movies, it seems like as soon as you report something like that, the kids are snatched from their families and put in foster care, and they're put in the system, and then they get abused in the system, and you know, they I don't know, they come out depressed and so on. So I think we definitely do have a very negative view of the subject and of what happens. So just to clarify, there is an investigation that happens. It's not something that happens automatically. John, is there something that you want to add to this?
No, I mean, what Nancy said is perfect. It's not such an automated process as you would think it would be, right? It does take a long time. It's an accumulation of events. It's not a one event end all type situation. So if abuse happened and, you know, law enforcement was called, or the person was brought in and talked to with a therapist or something like that, that's not an automatic, like that's not a, you know, you're not going to get thrown out of your house. Your children are not going to be taken from you. There's a bunch of steps that the system goes through, just because, like Nancy said, you don't actually want to bog down the system by taking every child away from their family. You don't have the resources to take care of them. So, but the steps are there to kind of adjust the behavior of the person doing the abuse. It's giving them a chance to adjust themselves and to become a better person by law. Okay. Right? Because sometimes you need that push, you need that reality check that if you don't do this, you will lose your child. Maybe not today, but in the future if you don't take the steps necessary.
America, do you feel like what you've heard helps a little bit or encourages you a little bit to maybe speak up?
In my opinion, it makes me more comfortable saying that they won't be necessarily taken away due to speaking up and saying what's going on. I think what they were saying shows that you shouldn't be scared and you need to get the help that you need. And I think most kids are just scared that if they do say something, they'll be taken away and they won't see their family anymore. So what they said makes it more comforting to the kids that need to help and the kids that are afraid to speak up. So it shows that they will be able to get better and get the things that they need.
But now, I'm going to talk about you personally. So you have a friend that's going through this, and you want to speak up, but obviously you're worried that you might lose your friend's trust. Am I kind of correct? Okay. So how will you work on convincing your friends that maybe they should speak up, or that this is the right thing to do? Now you're convinced that it's the right thing to do. So how would you actually convince the person that's going through it?
When it comes to convincing the person going through it, it's more difficult because you don't know exactly what they're going through and you're not feeling it yourself. So they're going to think, oh, they just want me to get better, so I would stop going to them and telling them stuff. So they'll trust you, but they'll trust you to keep the secret, not to tell you to go and tell somebody else that can help. They of course want the help, but they're afraid. And I think a way you can try to help them is if you get advice from like a professional like Nancy and like see it from their point of view. You don't have to tell them your issue, but you would see what would actually happen.
Okay.
And they would understand from their point of view what might happen if they decide to get the help, and I think that would be more convincing to them.
It seems like all we're hearing is the same thing, right? There's just this fear and there's this myth that's out there that's somewhat created by Hollywood, and I think the intentions are good, that you put out these movies that tell people that here's the consequences, but it's always this weird time lapse where we don't actually see the entire cycle of what's happening before somebody's taken away from their family or something like that. So it's important to understand that the movie's 2 hours, real life is a lot longer. There are steps that have to be taken, and all it takes is one person to report. All it takes is one person to take that first step. And if you're not that person, then that cycle might never be broken, right?
So you touched on a great subject, the cycle. So how do we get that one person to report? I feel like there isn't necessarily one answer that we can come up with today to resolve this issue. But one of the biggest issues here is getting that person that is going through the abuse, that is going through this violence, to actually speak up and be comfortable enough to do so. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about domestic violence and how we view it here in church. So I know that our church does not allow divorce for this reason. Should a family just live through it silently? How does the church view it?
I think from the perspective of the church, there's almost a threshold,
Okay.
right? So divorce might not be allowed, but at a certain threshold, separation is going to be recommended, right? So we have to understand that God doesn't expect us to continue to live in a marriage that's going to be dangerous for either party, for the kids. That's not God's expectation. God's expectation is for the marriage to be a church. And when you walk into church, there's no fear. There's nothing that, you're not scared that somebody's going to hit you as soon as you walk through those doors. So his expectation of a marriage is not the violence. So even though our church doesn't allow for divorce, because it's still an issue that can be fixed if the person chooses to go to counseling, take certain steps to better themselves. But the person that's being abused, I think either them or somebody close to them that's seeing this, they have to kind of push the envelope and take those first steps. And I think the church will support them. I think a lot of people are under this misconception that the church is blind to what's happening in society, and it's not. It's very aware, and it's very in touch with what's happening in society. Sometimes the steps the church is choosing to take is to give everybody the opportunity to take those. It's exactly like the law. Like, the law doesn't snatch your kids right away. The church is not going to divorce you or separate you right away. There are steps, but there is that threshold. When you reach that threshold, the church will step in.
Mayurka, I have a question for you, and I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you for an example, but have you seen any of your friends at church go through this?
The divorce or?
No, the domestic violence.
When it comes to domestic violence, I think it's mainly verbally. And
Okay.
it happens at our church because at our church no one can really hit each other at church. It's known to be, that's a big no at church because that's what we've learned at. But going to school and then having church on the weekend, some people have two different personalities. So one might blend in with another, and at church there might be rumors that go around just like at school. So in my opinion, sometimes our church turns into a school in a way because of how rumors are spreading and how everyone these days aren't really focusing on God when they go to church. They focus on who they see and who they're going to interact with. So I see it in a verbal way more than an actual physical way.
Okay. So none of your friends have actually come to you and said, we are going through something at home.
Some might be honest. Some have come to me and they've talked to me about it. So I've told them, of course, go to Abuna, because I, of course, like John said, don't feel like I have the power to do anything about it because I am a kid. So, of course, I tell them to go tell an adult. And that's honestly the best advice I could have given them, since I don't feel like I have the authority.
So, coming from an Egyptian household, I want to touch on this subject really quick. Where does discipline stop, and when does it turn into violence? I think we've all gotten, spanked or every once in a while growing up. I don't know if it was just in my household or yours as well, but I do hear this from a lot of kids that grew up in Egyptian households, that yes, the discipline was physical in a way. We got yelled at, and I think we turned out pretty well, but where does it become abuse? Nancy?
If you want to study, the risks of corporal punishment, like, yes, we may have turned out okay, but there's also other internalized risks, that we talked about in an episode before about self-esteem. So if I come from a home where I'm constantly getting hit, my self-esteem is going to be very low. Like John said earlier, these kids, they're very anxious, they're skittish, they're not secure in themselves. And if you're trying to build strong, functioning adults that are also have strong emotional well-beings, then it's important that it's not just we're looking at a quick fix. Like, corporal punishment is a quick fix. It's inducing fear on this child. Like, I'm going to slap you and I'm going to induce fear. Now, if you want to get into like the law and the legal stuff, according to Child Protective Services, it's considered abuse when you are spanking somebody and it leaves a mark, or there's a bruise or a cut. So if I spank my kid and there's no mark and there's nothing there, then it's meaningless. There has to be some sort of mark, bruise, cut. Again, I'm not saying this to justify child abuse or spanking or corporal punishment. There are better alternatives to parenting that I strongly suggest.
So from what I'm understanding...
Wait. Okay. So, growing up, my mom used to use the ship all the time, right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, I understand what Nancy's saying, right? Because a part of it is very difficult to deal with as a child when you know that the ship is coming out, or like that whatever's happening in your household, like the belt or whatever's, But I think it's when you're hitting a child while angry, I think that's abuse. I think that's when, and I think that's why by law, corporal punishment is okay unless you leave a mark. Because when there's anger, you're losing control.
So you're saying that we hit our children when we're not angry?
Yes, I think that's the difference between corporal punishment and abuse, from my perspective at least. Obviously, Nancy has the therapeutic aspect of it, but I think there's a huge difference between corporal punishment and hitting your child in anger. Hitting your child in anger is abuse because you're doing it out of loss of self-control. But when you're punishing your child using corporal punishment, you should not be angry doing it, right? So there's a big difference between my mom running like crazy around me in the apartment with the ship going, I'm going to kill you, she's lost control, right? Or when she calmly sits on the couch and says, "Ta'ala habibi, I'm going to show you the ship." You know, you haven't lost control there. That's corporal punishment. So I mean, that's how I think about it. It's, you know, what state of mind are you in when you're actually doing it?
Okay, so from what I'm seeing is Nancy says it's a no-no in all situations. And John says that it can be justified at times. So just to wrap up really quick, and again, I'm going to go to Nancy for this one. Looking at our teenagers, how does this affect them? And does it start affecting them when they're young?
When it depends on what you're aiming it towards. Like, again, when I said corporal punishment, like, I do agree to some extent, you know, like, it's not the most ideal form of discipline, but again, people do use it. I've had parents tell me that they've spanked their child, but it depends on how the method is executed. So if I am grabbing my shoe and I lost control of my emotions and I allow the anger to execute that parenting style, then I'm doing it not with the intent to discipline, but with the intent that I'm frustrated or I lost control as a parent and I want to regain control. So there's better alternatives that we can use as parents to discipline our children. I mean, I'm not saying no completely, but it should be a last resort. There's other options that we can try. And when it comes to our children, we want to build parenting relationships where there's respect, not fear. So I want my child to respect my authority as a parent. I have kids that they don't. They are afraid of their parents. I can't have a relationship with my dad because if I tell him something, he may like yell at me and flip out and hit me. So I'm going to keep it secret. And it causes dangerous habits. Like kids start lying. Kids start, you know, making excuses and doing things they shouldn't be doing. So it opens gateways to other unhealthy behaviors and habits. So it's best that we have an open relationship where we could communicate and at the same time we set boundaries, we set structure, and there's discipline.
Okay.
I want to ask Mayurka if nowadays there's a ship being used or there's like, if it's different. I don't know.
Nowadays, when I was younger, of course that happened, yeah. But for at least my family, they feel like since I've grown up, they don't think hitting or violence really works these days, because when we were younger, of course, we'd be terrified, but nowadays we're more out there and we're not that scared of it. I mean, we'd get hit and then the next day we'd like go back to it. Like we know we're gonna get hit and yet we still go back to it. But when we were younger, they'd use it as discipline, but nowadays it's just not as effective.
Domestic violence can be found everywhere. It can be in our schools, in the church, and even at home. So how do you help? Well, it's simple. If you see it or know about it, then do something to help that person. Don't turn a blind eye to it. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on Come and See.